Welcome to the Sermon B-Side Podcast, a podcast of Liberti Church in the Harrisburg region of central Pennsylvania. Sermon B-Side is designed to be a resource to answer your questions and to go deeper into the conversation started by each week's sermon.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Liberti B-Side Podcast. I'm your host, Jenna Wright, and join with me this morning is Matt Laloyan. How you doing this Monday morning, my friend?
I'm doing pretty good. I could definitely do with less rain.
Yeah.
But besides that...
Did I hear you got flooded out of camping this past week during some of the rain?
We did. We were camping Thursday and Friday nights last week, and Friday night, and thankfully it wasn't raining hard, but it was raining pretty steadily.
Yeah.
Where we were for the entire night, and this tent was a hand-me-down that we got from some neighbors some years ago, and we've tried to waterproof it a few times.
I was going to say, I think I've heard of this tent flooding multiple times now.
This is at least the second significant flood of this tent, maybe the third. And so we decided to scrap it after that. But we were able to throw another tarp over it and stay, mostly dry the rest of the night. So it wasn't a miserable experience. And actually, we had a lot of fun camping, and those things become stories that then get told over the years too.
Yeah,
so there's a fun part.
They become stories after
the fact,
not during when you're cold and wet miserable.
But everybody was a champ. Everybody kind of figured it out, and we all huddled together in the area that the tarp covered, and it was good.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, lots of rain, getting rained at.
But, segue, some other people got wet in a completely different way yesterday at Liberti Church with a few baptisms.
Few baptisms yesterday. Look at that.
We did. There was 3 baptisms yesterday. So yesterday was a great day at church, too, we have covenant entrance days both yesterday and then this coming Sunday.
Yep.
8 men and women total between the two. And so yesterday we had 6 folks come into covenant, and 3 of them, all from one family. It was really sweet. Got to baptize too. So that was a really joy-filled day and day of celebration. And just those are always just significant and special days for the life of our church that I love.
Yeah, it's really fun having all those girls in the gospel class Jordan and I got to lead last year.
That's
so they were from our first class. So
that's the first one you guys did together.
Yeah,
that's cool.
Feels pretty cool.
That is cool
to see that come to fruition, and
really
seeing
sweet.
Families coming into covenant together is real sweet.
It was.
I would say.
That was.
Well, also yesterday, you continued on our John sermon series in John chapter 19, and you didn't start at the very beginning of the chapter, so I'll let that slide. But you did preach on a pretty big thing in the life of the Christian church, the Christian life.
Yeah.
So why don't you maybe for the people at home give us a quick summary of what you preached on from John 19 yesterday, Matt?
Yeah, so John 19, and especially the second, half of it, 2/3 of it, is all about Jesus' crucifixion. Mm-hmm. It's been leading up to this for many chapters, many weeks now. Jesus has been preparing his disciples for this, praying for them. Last week in John 18, and then bleeding into the first half of 19, talked about the betrayal, the arrest, the trial especially.
Yep.
But then starting in verse 17 and on through the end of John 19 is about the crucifixion. So we talked about that yesterday, really looking at Jesus' crucified life and then our response to that being a cruciform life. So those are kind of the way we looked at the passage. In looking at Jesus' crucified life, we talked a little bit about what crucifixion actually was.
Yep.
And then talked about how our first and primary response is what John actually says right there in the text, and so that we may believe. He gives us the detail that he gives, not to be sensational, not to sell copies, but so that we might actually believe.
Yeah.
And then the ongoing response in the Christian life is to live a life shaped by, that's the idea of cruciform, is to be shaped by the sacrificial work of Jesus on the cross and to live a costly and sacrificial life of our own.
Yeah, and that's helpful. I think you challenged us yesterday to look at the cross with fresh eyes. And really that's kind of been the challenge of the whole Gospel of John, is to look at Jesus with fresh eyes, but specifically the sacrificial death of Christ in what we covered yesterday in John 19. And that, as if you've been in church for a long time, you've likely talked about the cross and the gospel. We talk about being gospel-centered here at Liberti and the whole Acts 29 network that we're a part of. So you made a good point yesterday that we never grow up from the cross.
Yeah.
And so applying the cross in our day-to-day lives, in our own hearts and in the lives of others is really integral to what we're doing and applying a text like John 19.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, what are some thoughts that you have for the Bible studies that are still meeting this week, Matt, and applying this text together?
Yeah, I think it is like it would be really hard to every single week try to do like a detailed dive of like what is crucifixion.
Oh, yeah.
But it is the kind of thing for me that periodically having someone else, either in my reading or listening to someone else's sermon, to have someone actually walk through like what is crucifixion again? Because we talk about the cross, we sing about the cross, like almost every single week at the communion table, we have a cross in our space. So it's like it just is so foundational and central to the Christian life. That it's really helpful for me to periodically actually have someone walk me through, like remind me in some kind of detail what that is. And how much more that magnifies the love that God has for us because Jesus went to that cross and endured that cross for us. The penalty of my sin that he was paying there. So yeah, we never get over it. We deepen our appreciation of it. So I think as you get into Bible studies this week, there's certain moments when the weight of the cross hits you. And it's really hard to predict. It's not really easy to prescribe. So like in a room filled with the people that we have at Liberti Church yesterday, I don't expect that like the weight or the detail hit people in all exactly the same way. But there might be some folks in your group that like that's a weightier and newer thing, or for whatever reason, because of the circumstances that God has you in right now, the meaning of Jesus's work on the cross is really standing out to you. And so I would say don't ignore that. Like if that's you and you're willing to risk the vulnerability in your group and just say, it just hit me different this week. That would be a great thing to not skip over and go right into to
really lean into that being good news, even for right now.
Yeah. And it is meant to move us and call like all the hymn writers that like have those moments in their life and then give voice to that in beautiful song lyrics that we still sing today and even modern hymns that do that really well. I quoted Stuart Townend yesterday. And so don't skip over that. I think that would be a great way to use
this makes me want to break out in the old rugged cross really bad. I'm fighting it in my body.
That's the good Baptist in you. You got to have some old rugged cross.
I'm fighting it so bad.
Which we got that lyric in during the closing song yesterday of Man of Sorrows. Not that actual song, but they throw the rugged cross lyric into that. So that's a great one. And then the question number 4 in here, for those of us who are Christians, which is many people who listen to this podcast, and most of the people that are there on a Sunday morning.
For sure.
But what does following Jesus cost you? I think that's it's so easy to, because of where we live, the time and place in which we live, the ease and the comforts and the amenities that are available to us, to all of a sudden wake up one day and realize like we're not actually pursuing lives of costly sacrifice, and we're just pursuing lives of comfort and ease and avoiding hard things and avoiding costly sacrifice. And I think that in responding to the work of Jesus on the cross and knowing that he himself calls us as his followers to deny ourselves and to take up our cross and follow him. That'd be a great thing to open up in your Bible study group this week, is to talk about what does a cruciform life look like, and what does it look like right now? Like you may be someone who has those things in your past. I've taken big sacrificial steps. I have paid costs. But to bring that into the present and just say, it's not meant to be like a one-time thing, but a lifelong pursuit. So jumping off point for that question, we threw this in the doc too, is like, think about your vocation, think about your reputation, your finances, your time. There's so many others that you could talk about, but those are at least a few jumping off points.
And that's a good starting point for Bible studies. We can get into a little bit more detail about maybe a metric for a cruciform life that comes from a listener question near the end of the episode. So just want to plug that. If you are only listening for Bible studies, maybe listen to the beginning and listen to the end of the episode to hear that question.
Nice.
So to transition to listener questions, we've got 2 questions that are really text-specific, observational type questions. So the first one is actually coming from that section that you didn't cover yesterday in John 19. And this person's quoting John 19, the second part B of 19:11. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin.
Yeah.
And this person's saying, I don't understand how that follows the first part of the verse. So if you go back to that first part of the verse, I had it pulled up just.
This is Jesus talking to Pontius Pilate saying, you would have no authority over me at all unless it was given to you from above.
So this person is kind of wrestling with that and thinking, I thought all sin is equal before God. It doesn't feel like the next part of the verse makes sense in light of that authority statement. And, is this just a statement toward Pilate to make him feel better about his culpability in this whole thing? Any thoughts there, Matt?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a fascinating part of the dialogue of the trial. Wish we could have kind of done a deeper dive into it.
Yeah.
So, to this person's question, in the sense that all sin is an offense against God and separates us from God, in that God is holy and perfect and completely blemishless, never sinned. We have sinned, and regardless of in the specific ways or how often or the magnitude, any sin in our part separates us infinitely from the holiness of God. Like the difference between holiness and unholiness is an infinite chasm that we can't bridge. So in that sense, it is all equal before God. Jesus here in talking to Pilate, and Pilate's starting to have this fear and a little bit of a change of mind, maybe I shouldn't be executing this guy. Maybe I shouldn't be given the green light to execute
he's
Jesus.
not seeing all the evidence he normally would use for.
No, it says up above that, he says he finds no guilt.
Yep.
And the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders insist, nope, he's not, he is deserving of guilt. And then Jesus, so we get the sense that Pilate's changing his mind here.
Yeah.
And Jesus in this way, is not exonerating him and saying that he has no guilt. What he says there is that the one who delivered me over to you, that's the Jewish leaders specifically, has the greater sin. Yeah. So that means there's still sin for Pilate. There's still, and specifically, he's about to be in a cowardly way, using his authority in an inappropriate way. Like he should say, you don't have grounds to execute this guy. You will not execute this guy. I'm in charge. That's what he should do.
Yeah.
So he's abusing his authority by not using it the right way.
Yeah, and the ESV exegetical commentary kind of has, it says, the logic at work here implies that Jesus sees a distinction between what Pilate is doing and what the Jews are doing. The Jews are maliciously seeking Christ's death, whereas Pilate is an unprincipled coward faced with undesirable choices.
Yes, I love that. That's
great. That's pretty harsh, but unprincipled coward faced with undesirable choices. Yep. And so he's not cutting Pilate off the hook, but there is something sinister about the Jews leveraging the law of God at God
and, to kill the Son of God.
And trying to make this Roman official make that decision and be the arbiter of the law of God here. Yep. And there is something uniquely sinister about that, I would say, that Jesus is emphasizing here.
Yeah, and it really ties in my mind with what Jesus says elsewhere when he talks about how when people observe his miracles, the revelation of God and like the work that he's doing in his miracles, and they choose to reject him anyway. He says on a couple occasions, then the famous woes, he says, "Woe to you, because it's going to be more bearable in the day of judgment for Sodom and Gomorrah than it is for you." And that's a huge statement.
That's rough.
And that is a gradation. He's introducing a gradation of the revelation that you have been given is such that you are going to be held accountable.
You're responsible for that.
And responsible in a sharper way, in a more intense way than people who didn't experience that same level of revelation. So Sodom and Gomorrah, of course, Old Testament poster child for the most sinful society that you can be. And Jesus is saying, shockingly, right, in that moment, it's going to be more bearable for them in judgment than it is for you. And so in the same way here, the Jews have all of the revelation of God. They have the law, they have the prophets, they now have Jesus doing all this work and teaching among them, and they're using it, like you said, they're leveraging the law of God to kill God.
To kill God.
Yeah, I love how you said that. And it's
something.
It's horrific. It's tragic. And it's what we would have done. But because of the magnitude of the revelation that they've received and are rejecting that overtly, that's where Jesus can introduce a gradation of like that they have the worst sin in this.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to this listener's second question. So they're asking about in John 19:39, John specifically records that Nicodemus brought 75 pounds in weight of spices for Jesus's burial. This person said, this seems like a random detail. Would that have signified something to the original readers that we miss out on?
Yeah, love the question. So one of the lenses that's a beautiful way to look at the crucifixion of Jesus and the trial and crucifixion of Jesus. And Mark's gospel especially calls this out, but it's absolutely there in John too, is to look at Jesus as a king. And the irony of a crucified king who is being mocked for being king of the Jews, but who actually is the king, not only of the Jews, but of the world, of the universe, the king of kings. And so the way that Jesus is buried by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus is the kind of burial that you would give to someone who is truly a king. Criminals crucified on a cross, right? Again, not allowable for anybody except slaves or conquered people of the Roman Empire. They don't get buried with this kind of pomp and circumstance and ceremony.
No.
The expense that would be is significant, significant expense. Both the tomb itself. Most people were buried in common graves. Like this is a incredible, like Joseph of Arimathea's tomb is the tomb of an incredibly wealthy person. And he's giving use of it to Jesus for Jesus's body. Nicodemus bringing 75 pounds of the myrrh and aloes to dress the body of Jesus is, again, it's the kind of burial you would give to someone who truly is a king. So that's the main significance that's there.
That's helpful. Let's get into some more specific questions. So this listener is asking specifically about crucifixion and that method being the plan of God. You talked about that yesterday, that God planned this thing out. We see all throughout this text that this is fulfillment of prophecies. We'll get into that a second. But this person is saying, I mean, specifically, why did it have to be crucifixion and not some other means of death by tree hanging? Crucifixion seems to be brutal, above and beyond need. Why did God plan it that way?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, I guess to say a summary answer, which then we'll get into maybe some specifics, is it had to happen that way because that was God's plan to happen that way. And even like when the later apostles like Paul talk about how like at just the right time Christ died for us, or like when the time was right. Like Jesus was born, the incarnation of Christ happened in a time and place, first century Israel and Judah, and during the occupation, under the Roman Empire. And so there was a plan of God that was at work, and the fulfillments that another person asked a great question about, and that we'll get to in a second, that kind of were teased throughout the Old Testament scriptures of how the Messiah would come and how the Messiah would die. All were building to that. But in an overarching sense, it had to be crucifixion because that was the plan that God had for when Jesus would be sent into the world, take on human flesh, and then die. It was going to happen under the Roman Empire, which this was their means of execution. And it was the only way, we were talking about too, that there was execution by hanging on a tree. Being
lifted up in the same way that Jesus even talked about earlier in John.
That's right. So you're looking for it in the fulfillments, which of course were part of God's ongoing revelation through the Old Testament prophets. You're looking for someone like a method of dying that's going to be the curse of sin is going to be upon this person. And we saw that in our liturgy during the 10:30 service yesterday of the Deuteronomy passage about cursed is someone hanged on a tree. Paul's calls back to that in Galatians 3 and says Jesus took our curse upon himself. You're looking for someone being lifted up, as Jesus has been saying. You're looking for someone who is pierced. The salvation of God's people comes through someone who is being pierced. And you have both in the hands or wrists and feet, as well as the side, Jesus being pierced on the cross. So those are the ways maybe the specific fulfillments happen.
To be honest, in this time frame, there wasn't really any other form of execution in the Roman Empire that fit all that criteria.
Right.
The one that would be most similar you could be burned at the stake, but typically you would just be tethered to a pole at that point and burned over a pile of logs. So I don't think there's any other similar execution method at this point in the Roman Empire that could have fulfilled all of those things.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And to this person's second question about it being brutal beyond need, I think you're seeing it right. That was F.F. Bruce, who was a great New Testament scholar, passed away 30 years ago or so now. He did a lot of great work on this in particular, and he talked about how there are means of execution that are more humane, that aren't designed to strip a person of every vestige of their dignity, but this is designed to do that. Someone asked me after the service yesterday, I thought it was a great question, is did Jesus die the worst death that anyone's ever died? And I kind of had to nuance it a little bit to say, yes, in the sense that he also was forsaken by God, like that God poured out all of his wrath on Jesus on the cross. And that's unique. So in that sense, it was the worst death anybody died.
Yeah.
I think there are also more there are methods of death that are more painful and more prolonged. I don't know that I've ever heard of a method of death that's more humiliating than this one. So if kind of breaking it down to the different components that I talked about yesterday, if it's painful, it's prolonged, it's humiliating, it was designed to be humiliating, and it was brutal, but there probably are more brutal, painful ways to die. It was prolonged, but there are more prolonged ways to die.
Yeah.
And there might be ones that are more humiliating that have been invented. I mean, our ability as human beings
the human proclivity
to
perpetuate evil with evil is pretty evident.
Yeah. But I think it does help us to see in the stark contrast of you have the exalted, glorious one, the King of the universe, at that level of humiliation. Like when Paul talks in Philippians 2, like even death on a cross, like that little phrase in Philippians 2, the detail of what we talked about yesterday in John 19 should make that little phrase go, whoa, like he humbled himself to the point of death. Even death on a cross, like the brutality, the humility, like should increase our appreciation.
There's a connection of Jesus's servitude or like making himself a slave there too. That kind of seems to make sense in the fact that crucifixion was reserved for a slave. So he's embodying something in order to make the perfect sacrifice on the cross in a unique way. Okay, so let's move on. So specifically, why is it important that so many prophecies were fulfilled in Christ's death? Some of them seem strange, metaphorical, or even a little out there. So is there meaning in each? Does the sheer number matter more than the individual fulfillments? Any thoughts there, Matt? Specifically from John 19, there's several that are mentioned.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think so John in particular, writing this gospel account later than the other ones, the flavor to John, like if you actually put them side by side with the other gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the word that I've heard probably most often scholars use it is sermonic. Like John's gospel is more sermonic in that it's been like the facts of what happened have been much more digested and are being shared much more in like a sermon kind of teaching form than just like more of a reporter, journalist, like factual account of the eyewitnesses. Like Mark especially is like so succinct. It's like, this is just let me give you all the stuff as quickly as I can. And John is more sermonic than that. So, I think what you're seeing in John and all the fulfillments is what the early church was given this glimpse into even after Jesus' resurrection. On the road to Emmaus, when he sits down with those disciples, he opens up the prophets in the Old Testament and says how all of it pointed to him and how all the Old Testament scriptures were pointing to Jesus. So I think what you're getting in like John's gospel is some of the fruit of Jesus's instruction, even in that moment of, hey, guess what? Remember when it said in Deuteronomy that a person who's cursed by God is going to hang on a tree? I was on a tree, and I was cursed by God. I took the curse of sin. Remember Genesis 3, God cursed all of you and humanity because of sin, but I just took that curse on myself. I think what you're getting there is that. So I think it's beautiful in both the substance of each and the magnitude of each. I think you have to have a baseline confidence in the way God's revelation was working through Jesus' instruction post-resurrection and through the Spirit, the Holy Spirit's ongoing. We talked about a couple of weeks ago how the unique way that the Holy Spirit gave not just illumination, but inspiration to the early apostles and help them see the clear connections that are there. Because if you don't, like, if you want to be cynical about it, if you want to approach this from like an atheistic perspective, you're going to go, well, yeah, the early church just like started flipping through pages and went, that's this, that's this, that's this. And I think that would be the cynical approach to it. The faith-filled approach to it would be to say, this is what they got to hear from Jesus when he opened up the Old Testament to them, and when the Spirit kept giving them open eyes to see how much fulfillment Jesus was actually doing.
Yeah, and you see like similar work from like a Peter in Acts, like giving a sermon in front of people, doing kind of like a whole overview and being like, look, this is how the gospel is a fulfillment of all these things, and here's why this matters and all the things. So I think that's a good helpful point. Let's move on to, so we got our last two questions are more kind of in the area in our cruciformed life. So really, now that we've believed, we've looked at Jesus rightly for who he is, what does it look like then to pick up our cross daily and follow him? So this person is asking, should Christians pray for relief while taking their cross to bear? Is there something good about suffering that we miss when we seek relief? How do we understand Christ's promise of easy burdens and light yokes while also he commands us to take up our cross to die daily?
Yeah.
How do you hold those two things in tension, Matt?
Yeah, I think holding that intention is the gift that is given to you through suffering, which is part of like your experience of being united with Christ. That like there's an intimacy of when we experience suffering for doing good, or for our identification with Jesus. Like that's where Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount that we're blessed when we experience that kind of persecution, that kind of suffering. Or that there's a fellowship Paul talks about of sharing in Jesus' suffering. So there is a depth of communion and intimacy that is made known to us as we pay that cost, as we take up our cross, and a gift in it. So it's the easy burden and the light yoke, or Paul talks about like light and momentary affliction, which if you actually look at the details of his life was anything but light or momentary. It was this lifelong, incredibly painful thing. So I guess in short, I would say it so much belongs to, at the end of the day, the mystery of what God's will is and what he's going to bring about and or allow in your life as one who suffers for the sake of helping you grow in fellowship with Jesus in your suffering, and showing that he is sufficient to meet you in that place and walk with you in that place, versus where he will show himself to be merciful and grant that relief. Like you get to see different facets of who God is in the way that he answers those prayers or not.
And I would also say there's nothing inherently wrong or sinful about asking for relief. If that relief is held in tension with the sovereignty of God in shaping us through suffering, that, we've quoted several verses this season of like, from Romans, like, produces it, the end result is hope, or even a James, like our completion, right? We're lacking in nothing when this is all said and done, or like a Philippians 1, where it's like, I'm going to bring this work to its completion on the day that Jesus comes back. But at the same time, like there's nothing, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, like Paul, even with the thorn in his flesh, he probably knows whatever that is. There's a lot of debate on that. That it's not going away. But that doesn't mean he doesn't ask for it to go away. Do you, any thoughts there on like what does it look like to shape a prayer like that? To say, God, like, man, it would be awesome if there was relief, but if there isn't, help me to trust you more. Like, what do you think that looks like, Matt?
Yeah, I think that's a great example that you brought up of Paul praying for relief from that thorn and whatever that is. Because he says there, that's in 2 Corinthians 12. He says 3 times, 3 times I prayed that God would take this away. Now, I don't know if that like means he never prayed about it.
After that, it was done.
At least in that moment.
But
at least 3. And it does seem like he reaches this place, not of resignation, not of like, I give up, but more of like an acceptance of like, I'm going to accept, because he clearly, understood something of God speaking to him at that moment of saying, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness.
For sure.
And so for Paul, whatever that thorn was, that was going to be one of those places that he was not going to experience relief, at least in whatever those days were, after that moment, for the specific purpose of forcing him in a very painful, regular way to rely on the strength that God provides
Yeah.
and realize his own weakness and his own dependence in a way that would be very easy for Paul to not realize, given how much God was doing through him
Yeah.
and how important he was in the early church.
Hmm.
So I think that's a great example of pray those things, like bring them to God, ask for relief.
Yeah.
Just like to what you said a second ago, just have in mind the category that he might say no, and it might be one of those moments where in your life, God's power, Jesus' power is going to be made perfect in your weakness.
Yeah.
And it's going to be a reminder of the suffering of taking up your cross.
And I guess my question to that point would be, how does that idea of dying to ourselves, experiencing suffering, how is that held in tension with the idea that Jesus in Christ, that like his yoke is easy, his burden's light? How do those two things square with each other? Because it seems like there is an accessibility of lightness, regardless of circumstances of suffering.
Yep.
And somehow those things go together.
I think it has to be through an eternal lens.
Yeah.
I think that's where the lightness comes from.
Yeah.
Because I don't think most of those circumstances aren't light. Like Paul, when he says that this is light and momentary affliction, he's comparing and contrasting it to the eternal weight of glory that
the full story
outweighs the yes.
Yeah.
So he's saying what this is doing now in this moment, and the fact that I'm suffering, not as an unjust person. Like one form of suffering is like our deserved self-inflicted suffering.
Yeah, for sure.
Like we make bad decisions and we have
there are consequences
that flow out of those. But when we're talking about this kind of suffering, which is just for our identification with Jesus,
picking up our cross,
or just like the afflictions that come to us they're just part of the brokenness of the world, and the fact that the world is groaning under the weight of sin too. And in those places, that's where I think there's this invitation to, because the invitation when you suffer is not to suffer alone, is not to suffer in isolation. It's to suffer with, it's compassion, suffering with Jesus, and the fellowship of Jesus' sufferings. Yeah. And the high priest, in Hebrews, it talks about how he's experienced all that we've experienced in these different ways.
He sympathizes
and has that compassion.
Yeah.
So I think that's where you can say crazy things, otherwise crazy things like, this is a light and easy yoke. This is a light and momentary affliction, even though very much it can be incredibly painful.
That's helpful. So carrying this out a little bit further, our next listener is kind of asking, how do I know, though, if I actually am doing this thing of living a cruciform life and of picking up my cross daily, dying to myself to follow after Jesus, identifying with him?
Yeah.
Is there a useful metric or simply more of an everyday measurement that comes from looking back at this, Matt, in our lives?
I think it's like most things in life, it's easier to see in retrospect. It's easier to see where that's happened.
Yeah.
I like, and I wish I had more time to unpack it yesterday, but I like this metric of following Jesus and a life of costly sacrifice will mean I'm saying yes to some things that I would otherwise say no to.
Yeah.
And I'm saying no to some things that I would otherwise say yes to. So let's maybe use that as a metric of kind of what that might look like.
What do you think is a good example of that?
Yeah.
Like something that like Christians in our subculture say yes to, but we probably should be saying no to for the sake of the costly part of following Jesus.
Yeah. I think we say yes to a life of comfort and ease.
Okay.
In a way that like is often antithetical to the life of following Jesus. So I think that's like true with our time. I think we say yes to, and you can kind of flip these around, right? Like we're saying no, we're saying yes. So like I think we should say yes to starting up conversations with people that we would never otherwise probably talk to.
Yeah.
And we should say yes to like pursuing friendships with people that we would never otherwise talk to. We should follow through on relationships that have been broken in some ways and still show up in those places
Yeah.
that we would otherwise just go, you know what, forget that person, I'm out. I'm not talking to you
moving on.
anymore. Right.
Yeah.
I think like those are things that I think is because those are sacrificial. They're hard. Those are hard things to do.
They are hard things.
There's so many days I'm like, I don't want to talk to this person. I don't want to talk to my neighbor today. I want to
I've
do.
never experienced that.
It's like I want to
Never.
do what every other suburban American family can easily do and drive into my garage and close the door and not talk to anybody on my street. It's so easy.
There's no part of me that wants that.
Okay, well there you go. You and I are different.
Yeah,
But there's days that it's like that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm going to say no to that, and I'm going to say yes to the conversation that I'd rather not have. So that's an example. Certainly and I love some of the work that our deacons are doing. The generosity seminar, like we're continuing to try to think through what does it look like to live generous, countercultural lives.
We're going to be talking about evangelism in the fall. So some things that to be intentional with evangelism means like we're probably going to have to say no to something to be able to have availability to pursue evangelism.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And so I think that's a metric to apply. And even as you think about your calendar is a good metric. Yeah. Look at your calendar like last week. Look at your calendar this week coming up and go, okay, like what makes up my life right now? Mm-hmm. And are there things as I'm pointing to those things in my life? And it like you have to think deeply about it. Like, vocationally, it's not just like, am I working in a job that is directly connected to the church or ministry? That's not what we're talking about. No. And some people are saying like, I'm actually gonna work this job and not pursue the climbing the corporate ladder thing because by staying in this spot, I'm provided for plenty adequately. Yeah. And I have more time. I'd have less responsibility at work, which gives me more time to be home with my family or to pour into the neighbor that I otherwise wouldn't want to talk to.
And sometimes the higher you go, the more moral implications that might arise and things that might not happen at your current level.
For sure. Yeah. For sure. So that it's not a matter of like the secular versus the sacred vocation. Right. But I think just like that grid of like, because here, so to go back to kind of tie this into the previous question. Yeah. Not at all. It's not like we're going to suffer and we're going to suffer for things that aren't sinful. Right. And so like to pray for relief when we're bearing our cross is right. Yep. But it actually is sinful to avoid suffering, to just like intentionally set your life up in a way that
you're pad your life.
Yes. And to say, I'm going to do everything possible to avoid suffering. I would really struggle to put that side by side with Jesus' call to take up your cross and follow him and go, how do those two things be consistent at all?
To be fair, I mean, suburban land was set up for that very purpose. Yep. So I do think this is an area that that question of does it cost me anything to follow Jesus? Yep. Because like maybe I'm only surrounded by Christians or whatever, like whatever that looks like. I think that's a really hard question that we do have to reconcile with the fact that Christ calls us to do this.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Cool. Well, that's all of our listener questions. Yeah. We've tackled Bible studies. We tackled your summary from yesterday. We even celebrated baptisms. I think that's pretty much everything from John 19, but any final thoughts for the folks at home, Matt?
No, so we got to do like a minute of silence in reflection yesterday during the service. And for what the cross of Christ is. And we talked last week, a couple weeks ago, about meditation and sitting in scripture and meditating on it, not just going from reading and studying to prayer, but like that middle step.
Which I got to do some of that at my spiritual formation day 2 weeks ago.
Awesome. I'm so glad you got to do that.
It's awesome.
And it requires that kind of like space, time, slowing down. Maybe not a whole day if you can't make that work in your schedule. Yeah. But like that's what it takes. So I would just say too, if like most of us, silence and slowness is a rare gift.
It's so hard.
And hard. That would be an additional, like the death and then this coming Sunday, the resurrection of Jesus would be beautiful places to like slow down, meditate on what John has written here, what God has revealed through John here in scripture. Yeah. And not just kind of like information content consumption like we do in so many other realms of life. Yeah. But really sit and dwell on it.
Awesome. Well, this has been another episode of the Liberty B-Side podcast. Thank you for all of your questions this week. We got quite a few, and even someone that doesn't always send in questions. So that was fun to get this week. So thank you for persevering with us through the end of the John series. And we hope you'll tune in next week.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Take care. Thank you for listening to the Sermon B-Side podcast. For more resources, information about our church, visit www.libertyharrisburg.org. That's Liberty with an I, Harrisburg.org.